Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks so much for joining in. I've got some cool questions for you. We're also going to keep an eye on the audience questions. Anyone watching, if you can pop your questions into the Slido tab, make sure you pick the stage over on the right hand of Hopin and then pick the Slido. And then hopefully if we have time at the end, we can answer some of them. But if we can get started just with everyone giving us a quick intro, if that's cool. So Alla, can you kick us off, please?
Okay, my name is Alla, and I'm a head of QA at ZIWO and a Postman fan. And I'm here today, and I'm so excited to share my experience with API test automation with Postman, especially that I do at ZIWO, because I introduced API testing there from scratch using Postman. And now Postman and Newman play an important role in our CI/CD process.
Cool. And Angel, would you give us a wee intro, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. So my name is Angel Rivera. I'm currently a developer advocate with CircleCI. And yeah, I'm super excited to be in this panel discussing, Postman, Newman, and ways to automate all the things that developers do with APIs. My experience ranges from U.S. military all the way through to working for the federal government, startups, and enterprises. And throughout my 27-plus year career, I've pretty much straddled the role of dev and ops. So I've been living DevOps for most of my career, doing system integration, automation. But yeah, it's really nice to see APIs kind of take the stage these days and be prioritized.
Agreed. All right, Kevin, would you give us an intro, please?
Hi, everyone. I am Kevin Harris. I'm an API and Postman specialist from iQmetrix, where we power retail through our point-of-sale solutions. I've been with iQmetrix for a little over 4 years. When I started out, I was an API support specialist, and my focus has been on our API products. So when I think of how my roles evolved, I've become an API subject matter expert for the third-party developer and end user experience. And when I use Postman, I find myself using it for testing and troubleshooting, automation projects, consuming APIs to create test data, design integrations or processes. Plus, I also have the role of an API trainer. And in this role, I've actually introduced a lot of new users to the world of iQmetrix APIs and Postman. And in my 4+ year journey with iQmetrix, for me, learning about APIs and Postman really did go hand in hand, because as I've leveled up my API knowledge, I've leveled up my Postman skills.
That's music to my ears, because of course I work in education, and we're not just trying to educate people about Postman. We really want people to be more knowledgeable about APIs. So that's great to hear. The first question that I'd really would actually love to hear from all of you on, because you all have quite different perspectives. When we talk about automation, sometimes people think of it as a kind of magic wand or something that you just sort of flip a switch and that's everything all lovely and clean and automated. But of course, the reality is that it's more of a process, and it requires an upfront investment in time. And sometimes that can be quite hard to justify, especially maybe you're working in a startup or you're just limited in resource for whatever reason. So I'd love to hear from each of you about how you've gone about getting buy-in, making those automation projects happen. If we could start with you, Alla.
Yeah, I think that it's an important question because a lot of companies question if they need test automation at all, because it requires some more resources and time. And people in business and management roles invest in something when they see its value. So we, as QA specialists, should show test automation working. And in order to do that, rather than spending a lot of time, hours, weeks, or sometimes months for a single test suite, it's much better to release and execute your code often to demonstrate value to your employer, to management. Because if you don't produce anything, it looks like you don't make the money. And when you show the processes and how they improve step by step quickly, and you talk in their language, showing some numbers, how exactly it improves the processes, then they agree on it. And also one other thing is that what I did, I prepared a demonstration when I ran all the tests, executed them, explained all the risks that tests covered, and everyone was impressed. Like all the team was impressed how it works. So this is really important to speak their language, not technical one.
Absolutely. I think that value point is a really important one. And it's also one that's important when it comes to just raising the level of knowledge around APIs and tech in general, is just conveying to people the value. Angel, I'm guessing that this is even harder when you're talking about DevOps, because it's so hard to convey what DevOps even is, particularly to people who may be in a business role, a management role. So maybe you can tell us some horror stories about that.
Well, yeah. So, if we're talking, I think so. Let's take a step upwards and describe DevOps, right? So, yeah, there's obviously a lot of confusion in the industry regarding DevOps, the term, what it means, and the answer is it means different things to different individuals and organizations. And the reason I say that is DevOps at a conceptual level is about culture, right? Development culture and operational cultures, knocking down those what I call artificial barriers, right, between each team and role. Like I said, I've been in this business a long time, and it's just recently that, as an industry, we recognize that we have a huge problem. And but getting back to DevOps, right, it's a cultural kind of a change. So that means the reason why I say it means different things to different teams and organizations and individuals is it's all about people instead of technology, right? So that's kind of like the biggest confusion. It's all about changing how your teams and individuals collaborate around code and how that code is released, right? So if you take it at that higher level, again, right, you can see how it means different things to different people, because we're humans and individuals are different all across the board. So, you have to kind of basically figure out how best your teams can communicate with the individuals that are currently on your team, and then how they can also, collaborate a lot better, which leads to getting things done much faster, right? And then leveraging automation to get things done even quicker, right? So that's kind of where I stand with DevOps, right? And again, it could be that I hear horror stories, so I'll give you a horror story and then I'll shut up. But basically, right, I hear all the time about companies who have invested in adopting kind of a DevOps mentality and implementing like a culture shift within their teams. The problem is that lasts for about 6 months, and then they kind of start doing the same things, right? Reverting back to their old habits really, really quickly. And that is usually an indicator that someone has left the team, or some folks have maybe been transferred, and that's generally what happens is when you don't have those folks there to kind of cheerlead or buy in and keep the teams kind of straight, they kind of revert back, right? So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it, but it's really important that if you go down that road, you have to address it as more of a people challenge and not a technology challenge.
These are hard problems, like change management. That's one of the hardest things that we do in organizations. So Kevin, if we could turn to you, you've really implemented some serious automation from what I gather. Can you tell us how you made that happen?
For sure. When I think of, the people that I get to work with, on a regular basis, I'm working with a lot of new users to Postman. I'm working with a lot of experienced developers who are creating systems for their clients. And, time and time again, especially on all of those fronts, I see people doing things like this when they're doing testing and trialing testing different processes in Postman, where they'll do something like generate an auth token. And they're going to copy the auth token from the response, paste it to the header of a single request, and then they repeat that process for each new request. So when you look at that takes about 20 to 30 seconds per request. So these developers and other support people are wasting about 60 minutes for every 150 requests they complete. When you think of how quickly you go through that is a huge waste of time. When I demonstrate how to use environment variables in Postman by adding a couple lines of test script and show them how they can automatically add data from a response, it blows their minds, gives them a reusable process, and eliminates repetitive work. So when I think of how I got started much that same way of copying and pasting and wasting a lot of time. Then in my first summer, I was assigned to a large project where I needed to call a series of endpoints and collect IDs, where I would be using those IDs on subsequent requests until I could validate the data in the final response. So each day I was going through about 200 sets of data. And it took me about 1 minute of setup time before I could do my validation. In that first week, I was spending a little over 5 hours a day validating everything. So this meant, from a project perspective, we had to wait till the next day to review the findings. And fortunately, by the end of the week, I had figured out how to capture the IDs I needed through test script. And then I could complete my daily work in about 2 hours, meaning that anything that was submitted in the morning, we could review in the afternoon. Now, to put this into perspective, this project went on for about 6 more weeks. And had I not figured out how to automatically set environment variables, because I was still relatively new at that point, I would have spent an additional 90 hours doing very repetitive tasks over that 6-week period. Now, there are ways that I could have automated that even further, saving myself an additional 37.5 hours, because I could have gone through my data files in about 45 minutes every day. But, when you think about automating things and eliminating repetition, because I saved 90 hours in that project, this allowed me to focus on other projects. It allowed me to work on other work was not getting stuck in a backlog. And I was able to level up my skills even faster. So from a project perspective, this created a better experience for the end user and for the project as a whole. From a financial perspective, this reduced labor costs, which ultimately increased profitability. And, ultimately, when you're able to take repetitive tasks and automate them, that really does boil down to being a win for all stakeholders.
Those are some real gains, so that I'm thinking that the Postman product and engineering teams are going to love having heard some of that. I have another question that I'd like to ask everyone, and this is my favorite one on the list. This is a kind of a juicy question. When you work in any sort of QA or testing adjacent role, inevitably you might end up having some kind of sticky conversations. Of course, all software engineers agree that we need testing, we need to make sure everything's reliable. But the reality is that some of what you do is basically breaking their work. It's exposing vulnerabilities. And again, there are some messy people problems associated with that. So I'd love to hear from each of you if you have any advice for people who are maybe entering your specific field in automation and testing on how to navigate those sometimes difficult conversations, maybe with the engineering teams. So can we go back to you first, Alla?
Of course, yeah. I can't say that I have any sticky conversations currently at ZIWO, but I apparently had some in the past when developers, for example, were avoiding fixing something or implementing something. And what I understood for myself is that developers, as all humans, can be terrified when they see something difficult or new, or can procrastinate when a task looks like something that requests a lot of work or investigation. And another reason why it happens is that sometimes tasks or bug tickets are like poorly described, and a developer might misunderstand it and say it's a feature, not a bug, you know. And to avoid situations like this, first of all, make it easy for a developer. Make the bug report or a task for enhancement look easy. And in order to do that, always try to find a root cause of a problem and reliable steps to reproduce. Because if the title says, sometimes, in some cases, it's clear for a developer that it requires some investigation. And it's a problem. It doesn't look attractive, like an attractive work. Also, if you work in your team like for a long time, you already know what kind of issues usually raise arguments. And in order to leave no space for doubts or arguments, a QA specialist, I'm talking about QA specialist because like it's what I do. So we can provide some descriptions with references to requirements or provide our arguments right there in the ticket. So it will eliminate this argument or conversation. And also one other thing that in my experience developers don't like to do is to create something new, like making up a design or error messages, something like this. So if your problem sounds like error message is not doesn't have enough detail, it looks scary because it means that developers should find some nice wordings, and they don't like doing that. So it's nice when you have a designer in your team, but if you don't, try to provide some options for a developer because it can be scary.
That's some really good advice.
Yeah. And one other thing is that sometimes I see that QA team and developers are behaving like they're enemies. So friendly environment means a lot, and people should support and help each other, not fight with each other.
That'd be nice.
Yeah.
Let's mix up the order a bit. Kevin, have you had any of these tricky conversations?
Well, these sticky conversations in my world, don't usually fall from, our products. Typically, if we find a bug, our product teams are really, really good about fixing those bugs. So in my world, because I'm in such a client-facing role, most of my requests that lead to sticky conversations are from feature requests. And what we've come to realize in handling feature requests, because the original practice, I found myself submitting dozens of feature requests to our product teams every week. And these feature requests were coming from the development teams. And of course, they hadn't been reviewed by the client's business team yet. So this led to the product team having to do a lot of legwork before getting blocked by really the client's business team. And what we found is this process was distracting the product team from their primary focus, which was development work. So what we learned through that process is the process really needs to start with the account manager. So I get a feature request, and what I do is I submit a high-level description of that feature request to the product manager, or to the account manager, and I tell them what the development team is asking for. The account manager is going to know how to get the process started and who on the client's business team to engage, so that we can get the right conversation started. So in our world, because there is a financial impact to feature requests to the client, we do need agreements to be signed. We do need requirements to be gathered, and the final design and costs of any endpoint that we're going to develop need to be agreed upon before development work can start. So by adopting the best practice of starting with the client manager, it's actually streamlined the process. And, for the development team, that means they can be engaged when they have a project. They're not going to have to filter out projects that, are only going to get rejected by either their team or the client's team. And they can be engaged at the appropriate time. For me, I get to avoid sticky conversations because I, too, can be brought back into the process as I'm needed. So we've learned a lot over time in how to, avoid sticky conversations within our own products. Again, bugs are handled by submitting a request that, there's a bug. teams will look at it and fix it. In terms of client requests, that's tends to be where most of the sticky conversations come from.
That's interesting. Angel, do you have this type of challenge in DevOps, or is it more going back to what you were talking about in terms of getting people on board with adopting a change and actually integrating with DevOps?
Yeah, again, yeah, I'll still refer back to my previous statement about it's all about people, right? Technology is all about people, and those sticky situations are only caused by people, right? But when you add this layer of I'm not sure about Alla's experience or what exactly how she does QA, but I know from my past experience with organizations and different teams, there's a mixed bag of kind of manual processes and then some tooling to automate things, right? But at the end of the day, those sticky conversations occur because I believe that there is no standard way of doing things, right? So if you add that layer of automation to your processes, you can focus on the things that really matter and not the things that don't, right? Like those sticky conversations, because once you get into those conversations about roles and who's responsible for what, you're going to eat up and chew up a lot of time that could be better spent, right? Taking those processes and creating, I would say, like I guess physical communication type, practices and principles that everybody agrees with and that add value, and then automating those things, right? So then you eliminate a good portion of those interactions that are negative because it's in the automation. And if you need to make a change, let's change some code. But obviously you're going to have a communication, right? And it's a lot easier to kind of meet developers where they are and meet the QA people where they are in the middle road, rather than defending your role. And I will say that I do know a bunch of folks who they're new to testing, right? And QA, they like it. It's their passion. They're good at it. And then they have the veteran QA tester type folks, right? That are really scared. And I use this analogy when I'm talking about automation, because folks get scared about being automated out of a job, right? And I grew up in the 80s as a kid, and I remember when car companies were using robots, right? And my father worked at an automobile manufacturer for years, and yeah, it was like on his mind, right? Like, wow, this weighed heavy on him. So I kind of relate that to where we're going through in the technology era, right? Like with AI and all these things happening, developers and QA folks and testing folks, right, who are doing anything manually, they're afraid. But I don't think they should be, right? I think, we're in an industry where you have to learn these new skills. I wouldn't have survived 27 plus years in this business if I didn't constantly change. I always have this mantra, always be learning, right? Like you just have to accept that there's going to be changes. We're in technology, changes, whether they come in a period of weeks, months, or years, you still have to like get yourself into that learning phase and always be learning, always look, to identify patterns in the industry so that you can fit in there. I will leave you with this. I wrote a blog post called "What is a CI/CD Engineer," which kind of talks to that, right? Like, it's not a role, but it can be a role, right? It's about leveraging the testing, QA, performance measuring skills that those folks have, and the quality or the compliancy type skills they have, and better integrating into teams through the vehicle of automation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, automation is something that frees people up to work on more interesting, challenging problems. But in order for that to be the case, it really has to be democratized to some extent. The tech has to be in the hands of people, and that's a whole other challenge. And yet also, you can't avoid people. I've tried. Doesn't it work?
Okay.
I'm kind of kidding.
I would also say that like for the folks who don't understand, all right, so for like the test automation folks or the testing QA type folks who are not so knowledgeable in code, right, or in the practices of coding, I would recommend you understand the fundamentals of it, because the industry is just going that way. There is no like turning back. Those spreadsheets that you're using to manually like test code and all that, that's all being automated, right? Even graphical interfaces now have testing frameworks like Selenium and others, right, that are out there that will, you know, validate your tests. And if you once you learn that, and I've seen this a million times, right, with folks who have kind of mentored over time, I tell them about these tools, give them a little intro into it, and once they realize that, wow, this is like automating and they're freeing up a lot of their time, they love it, right? And then they become junkies of these tools and these concepts, which is pretty amazing and helps them with their careers as well, right?
Absolutely. Now, the subject of standards was dropped in there. And this is something that I would love to ask Alla in particular from your perspective. At Postman, we really have historically tried not to force anyone to use any particular format. But as someone who's worked in the API space for quite a long time, I know that for a really long time, there was a complete lack of consensus around standardization. I think that that's starting to change, and we're in particular starting to see some movement around open API. I'm curious. I'm always curious to know, as someone who's working in QA in the industry, does anybody care about standardization yet?
I can say that huge companies usually care about standardization and API test documentation because they have people. If they have resources, they have time for it, and because having a messy API is a way to price it for them, for onboarding, for everything. And little companies care less about it because, again, they don't have time and resources, and their main focus is a fast release. So yeah, like some people don't have any documentation at all. No API documentation, but those people who decided to have some rules, some standardization, I think that 2/3 of them use either Swagger or OpenAPI. That's what I see. But people who use documentation and standardization, it's really helpful for everybody because there's like some kind of a mental shift currently that we care about user experience and our users are developers. And it's really a challenge for a developer to use someone's API when there is no documentation or if it doesn't follow any standards. And there are millions of APIs currently, right? And all of them have different types of authentication mechanisms, data structure, everything is different. And it's really a challenge for our developers as users. So yeah, and what's interesting, I saw some statistics about it, and most people find like the most useful things in documentation is examples. So it's for everyone, and I noticed that I myself, when I see someone's API documentation, I go to examples to see how it works, and because it's easier to understand it from that part. Yeah, that's it, I think.
You just can't have too many examples. It's just the feedback that you always get in developer documentation of any kind, not just on APIs. And something that you mentioned there, we're running out of time, but I have so many questions. You mentioned developer experience, which leads me to career pathways. Now, I work in developer relations. Developer relations is becoming more well known as a thing, but there still isn't really a kind of standard career pathway into it. People tend to kind of fall into it. And one of the programs I work on at Postman is our student program, and we do a lot of partnerships with educators. and this is, I hope no one takes personal offense at this, but what I have found is that the more traditional unis, colleges, the more traditional education institutions are just miles behind on teaching APIs. But the more vocational courses like your boot camps, that they're just way ahead of the game in terms of even being kind of API centric. So I'm curious, I want to ask Angel and Kevin this. Angel, is there a pathway into DevOps, or is it one of those things that people kind of fall into?
Yeah, so I agree that so before I started with CircleCI, actually pretty much the past 15 years, I've been I live right outside of Philadelphia, but I spent a lot of time in Philly. And a couple of years ago, prior to joining CircleCI, I was heavy into the hackathon community, specifically the college hackathon community. And basically, working with college students, high school students, even not elementary, I guess, middle school. But anyway, in those cases, those folks were definitely not trained, so to speak, in modern day, software development practices. They were definitely trained, though, in the fundamentals, right? So APIs, for me and the folks that I worked with, the students understand APIs, but more so like as an SDK, right? To more of a monolithic kind of thing. But then they learn later on through things like hackathons and online kind of contest events that kind of interest them. They learn about the different types of APIs, right? Like RESTful. There's a ton of them, right? The different like RPCs, things like that. Those are all APIs, are just different in implementation. So the answer is yes, the colleges and institutions can do better, but I also always advise like a student, mentee or something, to actually go hands-on with technologies, right, and just get dirty with it, or get familiar with it, because the reality is, they're there. The colleges and institutions are there to teach you the fundamentals, and it's up to you to get your skills where you need to be so that you can be successful at whatever role you tackle. I also work in developer relations, right? So, and you're right, it's something that you kind of fall into. I've been doing it for 15 years because of the fact that I personally kind of went through the military, kind of taught myself even before that as a young kid, because I had a passion about computing, how to program and all that good stuff. But I started doing it professionally after being stationed at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station down in Florida, working with the space program. But that was my path. There's obviously many other paths that people take. I'm not knocking college students at all, but the ones that I've worked with and have hired and again worked with in my career, they come with kind of an expectation of like, oh wow, I'm ready to work, and then when they hit the actual job, the career, right, and they have to work, and they're not taught the communication skills, they're not taught the way to use tooling, like ticket systems, right? The way actual teams work in companies, right? So there is like a disconnect, and that's what I had spent a lot of my time doing, is educating them. Like, look, this is great that your computer science professors and all that give you all this work. You understand how these machines work, and code works, how it's compiled. But there's another aspect of this, which is, I think, even more important for your success, which is, learning how to commit code and all those other skills that are not taught, right? But they are learning in these events like hackathons and online contests and stuff like that. So I guess my advice is, put yourself out there, work in some open source projects, right? Because those are at least a free, close to reality type interaction that you're going to be experiencing, right, and engaging in.
Absolutely. We only have a few minutes left. I had so many more questions. Kevin, would you be cool with answering one of these audience questions here? We've got a question that says, Kevin, is it possible to run API collections without using another tool? Usually every time authorization tokens need added, the token value changes in time. So that would be about keeping your tokens refreshed and all that.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yes, it is possible. So a lot of that, depending on if you're working within Postman, ultimately the best way of keeping your token refreshed is working with environment variables. In a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, we've actually, started to use Postman in some very, very unique ways. So if you are using, say, a tool like the Postman Runner to run a full collection, then it's just a matter of where you place your auth token within the collection. You may be calling a series of endpoints that require authorization from different users, and so it's a matter of setting up the auth token at the key points. And same thing too, if you're using the Postman monitors, obviously if you're setting a collection up to run, every 15 minutes or every day, then it's a matter of putting your auth token in that collection and making sure that your auth token is basically sending the authorization token to the environment and it's being stored in that environment. So once the auth token is stored in the environment, then it's reusable per request. You just have to make sure that you're calling it through variables and adding it through test script or pre-request script at that point.
Cool. And would you like to have a bash at that last question that I asked, since we've got a couple of minutes? What are you seeing in terms of skill level with people entering the workplace around testing? What kind of training challenges are you having?
Well, for skill level, it all depends on how you've started. If you've learned your essential skills, whether it was from, say, a course like I did with Saskatchewan Polytechnic, or if you're somebody who's self-taught, if you can learn your programming basics, then that's going to give you the foundation of knowledge that you actually need to start, working with APIs and to start, entering that environment. So as long as you have that base knowledge, then, the other skills can be taught. Keeping to things like open API standards, with more standardization in the API world, that essentially is going to mean that, you can go from company A to company B, and whether you're a third-party developer, whether you're developing APIs, by working with standardization, then you're going to be able to learn those APIs faster. You're not going to have such a learning curve as you go from company to company or publisher to publisher. So that leads both ways, whether you're consuming the APIs or developing the APIs. But the key is getting that essential knowledge learned. And then, as you're on the job, if you're in an API role, take advantage of training. I was lucky when I started. I had 2 amazing mentors, and, take opportunities to practice, to learn, and to read. If you can follow API documentation, then really that is the lifeblood of working with any API. Bad documentation leads to a terrible experience. Great documentation leads to a good experience in using that API.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, something that I always tell people is any course, it only equips you with a foundation. You're not going to stop learning. And also, this is kind of the elephant in the room. I think in tech, we kind of need to take more responsibility for training people. We have a bit of a problem with that in some areas. And unfortunately, on that controversial point, we've run out of time. So if anyone wants to react to that, you can do so in the chat.
Yeah, I'll say
you
that
want to make a quick
companies
comment on
will. Yeah, companies. If you're a startup and you're an API play, or in that vein, document. It's the only way people are going to understand and use your tools. Again, if you're in an enterprise and you're building out a system, document, because again, people will not understand, that system. I mean, you're basically, think of it as exposing functionality to folks who know nothing about your products, right? And that I'll leave it at that. It's very important.
Yeah. It has tons of advantages. It's not only for end users, it's also for test automation, because it's impossible to automate something that you don't understand. So it was really helpful when I joined ZIWO and we had a very nice documentation, API documentation. It was just easy, read through it and write tests. It was like really easy.
I find as I
That's a
take
nice point.
sorry about that.
Sorry, on you go. No,
Yeah.
on you go, on you go.
Okay. I find as I am working with third-party developers, if I can take an opportunity to spend 90 minutes with them going through the basics of using our APIs, then in the long run, their integrations go faster, and that leads to a lot fewer support requests for our support team in the long run. So there is so many benefits to having that initial training.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. I've learned a lot, and it was really nice to have 3 quite distinct perspectives. So thank you very much for joining us. And anyone has any other questions, pop them in the chat, and the Postman team will keep an eye on them. Thank you.